Do you remember back at the beginning of the Fontaine Archon quests when Lynette says this?
I was just reminiscing about a place my brother and I would play when we were kids. It was just atop that hill over there. See?
No.
Well, it got me thinking, what did Fontaine look like before all the floods? Especially because this seems to extend not only to the plateau itself, but also much of Fontaine's borders that are level with the rest of Teyvat. So that's what we're going to take a look at today. But first, rocks. Magic rocks at that. I want to first look at the history of Fontaine and how we can relate a lot of real-world inspirations and geological history to it too. Now, disclaimer, of course, I'm not a rock, so always take these analyses with a grain of salt. How many rock puns are you going to fit into this video, B? I don't know, but I better not dig myself even deeper.
Oh, brother!
Yeah, okay, I'll just get into it. So, as a certified Teyvatologist, I can tell you that Fontaine is a terrestrial sea in the center of Teyvat and the origin of all waters. You just got that from the official Genshin site, didn't you? No.
So lonely.
It's an interesting choice to refer to Fontaine's waters as a terrestrial sea because Lynette points out people call the waters around Fontaine a sea, but in actuality it's an inland lake filled with fresh water. And why the word terrestrial when terrestrial is used to refer to a creature on land? But this actually does make sense when you think about it. Fontaine's water is not normal water and it's all contained within the region due to some primordial magic going on. But I like to think there's the implication of Fontaine's geography here too. Inland seas in real life can be connected to the ocean and sit in deep basins, and water comes from rivers and other forms such as rain, and it drains inward. And a drainage basin is an area where all flowing water converges into a body of water. What opposes this to being a basin is that water does still flow outward via the waterfalls, but most of the water is draining into the center, especially when we take into account that at one point in time all of this outer perimeter of Fontaine was still covered in land. Just hear me out here. I do think Fontaine is partially an endorheic basin because of the primordial water. Fontaine is literally the center of all water, and there are multiple primordial water checkpoints for water to feed itself back into and perform some Teyvat magic. As water rises or another flood occurs, most of the water will still drain into the center, but some will inevitably spill out. And we can imagine that the center, the primordial sea, is much further down beyond the floor of the rest of Teyvat seas. And so we have the elephant in the room. Could Fontaine actually work? This region is elevated high above the rest of Teyvat and it has waterfalls on most sides. Waterfall? No, water stay. Well, I'm sorry, I'm not doing it on purpose, I swear. See, there's this funny little thing called tectonic uplift. Think the Tibetan Plateau. Mountain ranges there were also lifted up slowly over millions of years, and you'll even find China's largest lake here, Qinghai Lake. So Fontaine likely used to be at sea level. Perhaps this could even be related to the pre-heavenly principles era. And at certain points, perhaps uplift was weaker, or there was more erosion, so water spilt over. But changes in climate can affect basins. Since Fontaine is prone to flooding, inflow and outflow could change and also cause rivers and land to change drastically. Fontaine's geography reflects that instability. And of course, barring the Tibetan Plateau, we can also see how influenced Fontaine is by Niagara Falls, whose water comes from the Great Lakes as the water from glacial melt carved its way through the Niagara escarpment and into the sea. At the end of this all though, there is a crucial missing piece to this very wet puzzle. Fontaine literally fjords all over the place. So, to give the most basic explanation of how fjords are formed, glaciers form at the top of a mountain and slowly slide down. As they head down, they also pick up tons of rock mass and sediment, which create the steep shapes in the mountainside. It erodes the valley and creates deep basins, and then the ice melts, filling it up, and ends up getting flooded by the ocean. But then we come full circle back to Lynette's comment about freshwater. Since Fontaine isn't connected to Teyvat's oceans, it isn't collecting salt water from it, plus it would be getting an inflow of freshwater from its small rivers. Here's my Fontainian geology theory after having studied at the Institute. First came the uplift. Fontaine at this time would have been very mountainous, but not yet fjordy, but as a result, most of the water ended up trapped. Over long years, glaciers did their thing overlapping, forming much of the landscape of Fontaine. That is, until flood after flood drastically changed the region, causing much of the rim of Fontaine to become eroded and leading to water escaping into the rest of Teyvat and meeting up with its sea, which would make it more of an open lake. But putting that part of geography aside, let's go and take a look around each sub-area of Fontaine to figure out and deduce, just like Sherlock Holmes himself, what is going on here. Starting with the exact same area that Lynette was gazing longingly towards. We do have an idea roughly of where the borders between Fontaine, Liyue and Sumeru are, so all of this is Fontaine territory, meaning Fontaine's floods should apply to it, and also meaning that at one point in time, these lands weren't submerged in water. This does also lend credence to the whole pilgrimage Fontainians go on. They probably used to be able to directly walk to the desert. Let's go over to Petrichor and you'll see where I'm going with this. Petrichor and its surroundings are certainly an interesting one. Its modern settlement, inspired by southern France and the Mediterranean, sits directly on top of the ancient civilization of Remuria. But what else does Petrichor sit on top of? What looks to be the tip of a mountain, same as the other parts of Fontaine. So perhaps the lands down below were the most affected out of them all, and over time, with flood after flood, all the other mountains ended up being fully submerged underwater. As the water continued to rise, it likely formed a lot of other water systems we see throughout other regions of Teyvat. There's this huge waterfall that carries on into the ocean, and then we have Sumeru's waterways, as well as various parts of Chenyuvale and Liyue, where the map does seem to suggest a lot of erosion. I did find some interesting things about Remuria while looking around. The only remnants we find on land are over here, and as we head down, the entrance is completely caved in, so we might as well cover a bit of Remurian lore. Remus, the guy running things, created Phobos, a symphony that was essentially his plan to stop the prophecy, the same prophecy as current Fontaine, which was that Remuria would be destroyed by floods. However, turns out Phobos was kind of a bit of a baddie, and it basically self-destructed and caused a giant tsunami. So the fact that Remuria is not only submerged underwater, but also for a lot of it completely sealed in, does actually make sense. Large tsunamis would cause buildings to collapse, and as it retreats, pulls all the debris with it, so rubble rearranges itself and fills the city, and then it's all sealed underwater through multiple floods. I would then think that before more recent Fontaine floods, parts of Remuria may have even still been visible. The only problem is the main part of Remuria we enter is through a portal, so we can't know for sure where it's actually located, but it must be roughly in this part of the sea. Something else I noticed while swimming around is the similarity in architecture between Remurian ruins and Fontaines. Remurian has more gold and musical accents. Deep down at the ocean's floor are actually a lot of buildings that have been here for so long they practically blend in with the landscape, with time having eroded it so much. Did you say time? Here, for example, on this stone building, you can just about make out some windows and railings. Now, of course, the largest settlement is the city, and there is quite a lot to unpack here. We have the city as it is today, but if we inspect the map closely, what do we see? A lot of walls and rubble. These two sides of the city in particular have always confused me, so let's take a closer look at them first. First up, over on this side, we have a working elevator, but it isn't really accessible from the city, and this aquabus line that I couldn't find any other evidence of underwater. Even these walls, I just can't figure out what is going on here. We can get the general idea of what its shape would have been like, but what exactly was the purpose? Not to mention this bridge starting here, so how exactly would anyone have even been getting up? It continues along this way again, and then nothing. Underwater there are remnants of things though. I did find this structure that also looks like it could have been a bridge, however it's facing this way, and another piece there. But the direction of the original bridge has no indicators underwater, except over near Anapausis. This also looks like a bridge remnant. Perhaps these parts could have been swept away, although I'm not entirely sure why they would have built a bridge toward it. But back to these walls. As we head deeper underwater, we do start to see the effects of layers of floods, but this part has no buildings or anything. This building doesn't look like it connects to the city, but it has yet another bridge that likely connected to the outer walls, and there's a door on this side, so that must mean the top of these walls were used as walkways. Heading deep underwater is a large sunken chunk of the city, entire buildings and streets, and if we check the map, what do we have here? The city used to be way larger than we see today, and so much of it is now submerged, there's not even much evidence left. See, if I head back out and to its borders underwater, there's nothing. The other side of the city is purely walls put here for flood prevention by the looks of it. The rest of Fontaine has has a lot of environmental indicators. Along the rim of the uplift, we can see how shallow the shore is, meaning all of these sections were worn down over time by water trying to escape. But looking over at the mountains is where things get really cool. This waterway that many Fontainian ships come and go through every day is one of the best examples I could find of glacial erosion. On both islands, there are some pretty noticeably large mountains, which, as the glaciers fell down, they would have over-deepened this valley. Hence, well, the deepness. Over to the right of Fontaine City is another valley with the same characteristics, and I think aside from Mondstadt, this mountain is the tallest in Fontaine. What does concern me though is the only settlement outside of the city being up here, and like, I get it, because they're up high to avoid floods, but they would also be the first to be wiped out if there was any kind of movement from on top of the mountain. So all in all, Fontaine's climate is just incredibly messed up. If we take a look at the map, we can kind of see where the genshin impact of the explosion at the Institute hit the most. I think, given how it's shaped now, and other indicating factors, such as this bridge and, well, the giant water cubes, that there was always a body of water, this would be called a strait, considering there's not a source and it's connecting two seas. Most of the damage to the land ended up being over here. I am almost certain that this body of water was not here before either. I mean, it's named a park, and this does not seem very park-like. Just look at the way everything is strewn around it. The explosion more than likely blew a hole here. The central laboratory would have been in the middle, as it is now, just a little bit lower to the ground probably. But these structures, it's pretty unclear what they were for. Some of them have very clear connections, like this one. I want to say they were likely used to transport water around. Over in the Irenes area are a few notable bodies of water, such as Loch Urania, which just means lake, so it's a lake. A very small lake, but it does have a source feeding into it from the mountain, and you can even see the damage the unstable bubble caused to the surrounding trees and environment. From that lake is this small waterfall and runoff. It is possible that the volatility of the loch, having been infected by the goop, caused surface runoff, resulting in this stream feeding into Fontaine's main lake. And you want to know the best part about this brook? They even made it fast flowing, which is very accurate to real life. It does go off in this direction too, but as the land is elevated, doesn't carry on. Nearby is also the Weeping Willow Lake, similarly a body of water that was also affected by the goop. Yeah, I don't think we can explain that in anything other than Teyvat magic, unfortunately. There is evidence of a village that used to be over here too, that I mentioned in another video. My theory is that this settlement suffered from a flood, and survivors most likely migrated to the city, because look at this map. See how many spots there are covered in water? And the state of the buildings are evidence in themselves. The Tower of Ipsissimus area, however, is a place that cannot be fully explained, because given the experiments conducted by the Ordo, there is a lot more going on, such as similar anti-gravity stuff to over at the Institute. The tower itself is implied to have been built by the Ordo, but the surrounding ruins seem to be Remurian ruins. It's not unprecedented that there would be Remurian ruins all over Fontaine, but aside from here and down below at Petrichor, I don't think there are any more. However, Fort Charybdis is named after Scylla's counterpart, Charybdis. There is a Greek idiom to be between Scylla and Charybdis, meaning being forced to choose between two dangers, and well, what exists underneath the tower, between Charybdis over here and Scylla over there? The Primordial Sea. Fontaine is a region that has been battered and bruised, and we can see this all in its incredible environmental design, inspirations, lore, and everything in between. But through it all, it has managed to survive the storm again and again to finally come out on top. Anyway, I think it's time for tea.